Moin, Lukas from Trickstuff. Let's bleed a Maxima. First off, take your 2.5mm Allen key and rest key your brake pads after removing your wheel. Don't put them on your workbench to avoid any oil contamination. Wheel is already removed. Then we'll take a 25 Torx and remove our interface so that we have free access for our pump. Next, we'll take an open end wrench and press our caliper pistons back into our brake caliper. Always apply the pressure parallelly and don't try leveraging it. If something gets stuck, just start fresh over before you bend anything. Whenever you're bleeding your brake system, it's always a good practice to use the bleed block to avoid your caliper pistons from falling out. Fix it in place with your pad screw. For the next step, we'll take a 3mm Allen key. First, remove your top clamp bolt. Put it away. Small stuff sometimes goes flying, so keep the small stuff together. Then the lower clamp screw gets removed together with the rest of the clamp. Place it away. Your bleed kit features a reusable zip tie. You can use that for your brake pump and you fix it to your handlebar. Best put it onto your grip so you avoid any scratching of your handlebar, and this way your bleed part faces upwards. In your bleeding process, you will never need to open the 3 bolts that hold down the caliper cap and the diaphragm that is below it. That only needs to be exchanged in a service and never opened during any bleeding procedures. That always happens through your bleed port. Next up, I will remove our caliper from the fork. If you work on your rear brake, then it's also a good idea to just hang it vertically onto the brake hose. This way you will always have the bleed channels in the brake caliper in the optimal position. So whenever you try to bleed your brake caliper, don't bleed it like this, bleed it vertically, also not like upwards, anything like that. This means that now we're ready to attach our bleed syringes. I already halfway filled them up with Bionol. You will need a M5 and an M4 attachment to start bleeding. First up, I will attach the syringe to the pump. This means removing our bleed screw from the pump. Place it somewhere safe where you'll find it again. Small stuff sometimes gets lost. And then you can attach your syringe. Excess oil, wipe off. Next up, we do the same thing at our caliper. Same tool, Torx 10. And we apply our M5 bleed syringe. To start off the bleeding procedure, I start pushing my oil volume from the caliper to the pump and back. You can see the air bubbles escaping. If there's any air trapped in the system, you have to always keep the syringes like vertical. This way any exited air will not get back into the system if you don't fully empty your syringes. So always keep a little bit of oil with the rest of your air in the syringe. To accelerate and improve this process, you can always give positive and negative pressure onto your system. So negative to the receiving syringe and positive to the giving syringe. This accelerates your process. You can repeat this as long as it takes to get rid of any air bubbles escaping the system. In the end, you will need to push almost all of the fluid from your caliper syringe into the pump syringe. Then it's time to detach the system. Before detaching, visually inspect your O-ring on your bleed screw to see whether there's any scratching or marks on it, and if in doubt, always replace it. I have my towel ready when I open my syringe because a little bit of oil will escape. In this position, when you detach your bleed syringe at the caliper, take care that the bleed port faces upwards so that no air gets back into the system. The oil should be filled to the brim. Wipe any excess fluid, and then the caliper is basically done. Now we can take the syringe at the brake pump and give it some vacuum and some positive pressure again. This way we are forcing the diaphragm to move in the pump and push any rest of air that could be trapped in the pump out of your system. If no bubbles come out of your brake during this procedure anymore, then you're basically done at the pump. Before closing your system at the pump, you can give your brake a first feel and see whether the bite point is to your liking, whether you get one solid bite point and not like a spongy feeling. In some cases, it can still happen that you will need to do an extra purge of your caliper to get rid of any air that might be trapped in the rear part of your caliper. That takes another step that I will show you now. For the caliper purge, we first remove our bleed block by dropping it, and then you can insert your open end wrench into your brake caliper and use your pump to pump your pistons out. When your brake caliper pistons are fully out, we can reattach our syringe at the caliper . Now we give the caliper a little bit of vacuum, just one solid pull. Now we can start pushing back our caliper piston using the flat wrench. Push parallelly and don't try leveraging. This way it's quite easy to push the pistons back in. Reinsert your bleed block into your caliper, fix it with your pad retaining bolt, and now we can push the rest of our fluid from our syringe over to the pump. Any air that might have been trapped in the caliper has now moved through the brake hose into our reservoir up here and out the syringe. Now we can detach our caliper syringe again like beforehand. Grab a rag, hold it parallelly to the ground and detach. All should be filled to the brim, and reapply your bleed screw at the caliper. To finish up the pump, as before, 2-3 pulls until you don't see any bubbles coming out the top syringe anymore, and then we can take off our zip tie. Just like the caliper, I use a towel or a rag and hold it against my pump to avoid any of the excess fluid running down the brake hose. In the end, before you open this, you always have to make sure that the last movement at the top is a little bit of pushing. In the last step, before you reapply your bleed bolt at the pump, also just like in the caliper version, inspect your O-ring. And if in doubt, exchange it. If filled to the brim, now your complete system should be free of any air. To install your brake pump back on the handlebar, use the lower half of the clamp first, then use the top half, and then you can use your 3mm Allen key to just slightly insert the shorter top screw. We then move over to the back. Now is the right time to not forget your attachments for your interface. And then, just like it's written on the clamp, the lower one gets 2 Newton meters, and then after adjusting your position, the top one gets 1 to 1.5 Newton meters. After working on your brake, it's always a good idea to check it. For this case, I will always use a bleed block. I will never use my brake pads. Brake pads are a lot softer, and you could misinterpret a soft bite point for a misbled brake, which can also just be caused by the brake pads. For the checkup, I will take my brake pump and my caliper with the bleed block and give it 3 good pumps and then hold a high pressure. Then I can visually inspect all of the points that I've been working on and see whether any oil is exiting. If no oil is exiting, then your brake has already passed the high pressure test. Now we want to check the bite point of our Maxima. After a short dead stroke, you will reach your bite point. This should feel like a solid contact point. And then afterwards, it takes relatively high strength to move your finger lever, even like almost till you can contact your handlebar. Reason behind that is that the Maxima has a really high mechanical and hydraulic transmission ratio. This means that with relatively low finger force, you can create really high pressures in your system. Then this means that it's completely normal that you can, after your bite point, move further on. As we're finished bleeding, we can start reattaching our caliper back to the fork. In some cases, especially if your Maxima is in your first installation, it can be necessary to properly align your brake hose with your pump. In this case, we have a Goodrich hose attached to this Maxima, so we can actually adjust the way that this line is routed. For this, you will need a 8mm open-end wrench. First, we apply around 4 Nm to the rear screw. Then we open the front screw by 1/4 of a turn. Then we will open the rear screw for 1/4 of a turn. Now we are able to route the cable just the way that we want it. Then we do the same steps backwards. We first close the upper screw by 4 Nm and then the lower screw by 4 Nm. Brake hose properly aligned. Now, before you put your brake pads and your disc anywhere near your brake system, you can use dish soap and a lot of water to get rid of any oil residue on your brake caliper or on your pump, and just give it a good scrub. Don't use brake cleaner or acetone or any bike cleaners. You can just use regular old dish soap and a lot of water to rinse it off. Reattach your brake pads by putting them back into the caliper together with a spring. Take a 2.5mm Allen key and tighten it down. In the end, last step, do not forget your safety clip. And then in the cockpit, we can finish it off by putting back our interfaced shifter, or in this case, the remote control.